Hi, Kylie. How are you? Oh, wait, hang on. Hi, Emily. I will unmute you so you can speak.
Hello.
Hi, there you are.
Can you hear me
Hello.
okay?
Yes, I can. Do you want to try to practice sharing your screen for just a minute? Let me see if I can. Just made you co-host, so that should.
Let me close some things out here.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the first National Art Education Association Museum Education Division peer-to-peer webinar. This is our first one of the 2018-19 academic year. I'm Michelle Grohe. I am the current NAEA Museum Education Division Director. I am joined by Emily Holtrop, our former NAEA Museum Education Division Director. And we both have worked really closely on the topic that we are talking about today, which is the NAEA has been partnering with the Association of Art Museum Directors on a nationwide research project that we have some preliminary results that we are delighted to share with all of you. We also would love this to be conversational, so if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to type them into the, if you're joining us live, you can do that through the chat box that we have on the bottom end of your screen. You can click on that, and we'll try to address them as we go along. And we have at least a good 10 to 15 minutes at the end where we will open it up for, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions just as more of the information sinks in along the way. And with that, I think we'll get started. And Emily, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about yourself and how you're involved in the project too, that might give some context for some folks.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Emily Holtrop, and my day job is I'm the Director of Learning and Interpretation at the Cincinnati Art Museum. And as Michelle mentioned, I was the NAEA Director of the Museum Education Division from 2015 to 2017. And I am the project director for the NAEA AAMD Impact of Art Museum Programs on Students' Research Study. It's a mouthful. And I started with this project from its inception and have had the honor of working on it with a great team of people, both at NAEA and AAMD and at RKNA, who is our research firm. And I think that, the fact that I was involved was just a result of being in the right place at the right time when it came to being part of the leadership of the Museum Education Division, and I've never been happier to be in the right place at the right time. What we're going to do today is I'm going to kind of sail through some introduction, some background, because I think it is important that everybody kind of knows where we started, where we've been, how long it's taken. Some of us have given birth during part and had major life events happen during this, because it has been a 5 to 6 year project. And it's been great. So just an introduction, but like I said, I'm going to kind of speed through that, because I know that the reason why many of you or hopefully all of you are on the call is because you want to hear the results. And but to get to the results, we need to get through some history. And our big question when starting this research was a really big one. And that was, what are the benefits of art museums to people? And like I said, this is probably one of the most vital questions that art museums and art educators face. And depending on the lens with which you examine this question, answers may be that art museums drive economic development, contribute to cultural understanding, we serve as community hubs, or that we support K-12 academic test scores. And while all of this is important, there really weren't a lot of data points to address the true value of art museums to individuals and communities. And to better understand and demonstrate the difference art museums make in people's lives, we felt that the field must advance research that holds up to intense analysis. Without research-based data, art museums may find it difficult to convince policymakers and civic leaders that they are vital to communities. as cultural institutions, that art museums are more than nice, that we are actually necessary. And resulting from this call for research on art museum impact, the Museum Education Division of the NAEA and the Association of Art Museum Directors forged a formal partnership in 2013. And the result was this intensive 4-year nationwide impact of art museum programs on students' research study. Funding from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and a 3-year national leadership grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services supported research that was conducted by RKNA. The NAEA and AAMD core team identified facilitated single-visit school art museum programs as the focus of this study because they are the most prevalent student experiences at art museums. According to a national survey of U.S. art museums carried out as part of this study, 96% of museum respondents offer these programs. Along with family programs, they often provide young people their first entry points to these learning environments and the objects they hold. So one of the things that we did, this presentation is actually part of the impact of art museum programs on students' research study user guide that we are creating. And it supports the study's findings on how facilitated inquiry-based single visit art museum programs might impact participants across 5 capacities, which are creative thinking, critical thinking, sensorial and affective response, human connections, and academic connections. And it was conducted at 6 geographically and collection diverse museums in 7 school districts across the United States. And it provides a valuable and evidence-based insight and language for talking concretely about the benefits of students' engagement with original works of art during a facilitated single visit program. That's a little bit of an introduction. So like I said, the study need really emerged out of simultaneous discussions within the NAEA and AAMD between 2010 and 2011. We both identified a lack of rigorous research to respond to the questions about the effects of facilitated single visit art museum programs on students. While there are several studies on multi-visit programs, there's a lack of information about facilitated single visit programs. What happens during that one-shot single visit programs? And this was considered problematic as facilitated single visit art museum programs are the most common ways in which art museums serve school students. Only the studies of the facilitated single visit programs at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art have begun to fill this research need. However, the studies at Crystal Bridges focus on the teaching of one specific museum with a specific collection and student population. By contrast, this study sought to understand programs that represent museums nationwide so that the findings of the study would be generalizable to the field at large. So our research question is, what are the benefits of art museum programs on students in grades 4 to 6? Specifically, what are the benefits of facilitated single visit art museum programs that are guided by inquiry-based pedagogies? And our hypothesis was that the shortened duration facilitated single visit art programs affect students in complex multidimensional ways. There is not one direct effect, rather there are potentially multiple interrelated effects that are central to the education of young people. So that's our why. Our who. You really can't do a project this size alone. I don't expect you all to be able to look at this and see everything on this, but it is a really great way to show all the people that were involved in this research initiative, from our funders, which were the IMLS and the Crest Foundation, to the museums, and I'll go through those in a second, to the school districts, and also the teams at NAEA, RKNA, the museum educators, and the advisors, and the task force, and the critical readers. I feel like, it's been a large family that's been working on this since 2010, and we thank everybody for their generous dedication to this, because this, I want to stress, this is all volunteer work. And we really appreciate those that served as advisors and representatives from AAMD and museum educators and NAEA, contributing their time and a lot of time to the creation and making this all happen. So like I said, I'm gonna go through this really quickly, and I joke with Michelle, I'm probably gonna throw in my Michigan voice, which means I'm gonna talk really fast, so I apologize. But we will make these slides available, and they're kind of boring slides, but I wanted to make them boring slides So when we made them available, you would have the information you needed. So the study origins really started in 2010. And like I said before, between 2010 and 2011, NAEA and AAMD were having conversations, and we both realized that research needed to happen into single visit art museum programs on students. And one of the wonderful things about our field is that we all know each other. So it was very easy for us to talk to AAMD and say, hey, let's work on this together, because it is something that we're all facing. Between 2011 and 2012, NAEA developed a research agenda with the help of Randy Korn of RKNA to answer the question, what are the benefits of art museums to people? It's a huge question. And part of the process included identifying audiences that would be served by a research agenda. So I want to stress that this is just the first study in a research agenda. And hopefully more are to come. I encourage more to come, even if I'm not the one that's working on it. And like I said, in 2013, the Museum Education Division determined that facilitated single visit art museum programs were to be the focus of the first study of the research agenda, and NAEA convened a task force to define a scope of research study focused on the impact of facilitated single visit art museum programs on K-12 students, develop an RFP to plan the study, and at that time is when we formed the formal partnership with AAMD. So this is a really busy slide, but in the year 2014 to 2015, we did a lot of planning. And I think about this in seasons. So in the summer of that year, and I want to stress that our calendar is on the school year calendar. So our calendar always starts in September, just like school does. So when you see summer, that means the summer before. And in the summer of 2014, we received funding for a planning year from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. And we contracted the research team of RKNA for planning, and the Museum Education Division Director at the time completed a Kress Museum Education Fellowship at the Clarks Institute, and she spent substantial time working on launching the project and creating a preliminary framework for an annotated literature review. In autumn of that year, the NAEA AAMD core team worked with RKNA to develop a strategic framework for the research initiative, focused on articulating the value of art museums to K-12 community, and a working group comprised of about 11 art educators representing NAEA's geographic regions and a range of art museums types, sizes, and communities met to identify the key components that influence research design, including program elements, possible student capacities, and possible student capacities to investigate. In the winter, we submitted a proposal to IMLS for a national leadership grant to support the study. RKNA conducted a state of the field survey to explore the prevalent practices of facilitated single visit art museum programs, and conducted stakeholder interviews. And we had an advisory group representing various stakeholder audiences that was also formed pending funding of the study. So we were working ahead with the hope that we were going to get funding. And in the spring, we confirmed the capacities of focus for the study and established a set of criteria for site selection, and then began reviewing potential museum sites. In year one, which was our pilot program, 2015 to 2016, autumn, this was the really happy phone call that I got when I found out or emailed that IMLS granted funding for the study. And we formed the core team that had been working together, came together formally. And the core team that has worked on this project since has remained the same, with a few additions here and there, but it is representatives from NAEA, AAMD, and RKNA. And at that time, we also hired a project manager. We saw that that was going to be very important for the day-to-day running of this grant, because as I said, all the museum educators working on this have day jobs, and having somebody that could manage the day-to-day was very important. In the winter, RKNA developed instruments for the study, and we received approval from an independent institutional review board, and the Walters Art Museum signed on as the museum partner to pilot the instruments and the protocols. In the spring, we completed an extensive literature review, which is available on the Museum Ed's part of the NAEA website, and there's a link here. And to develop a full understanding of the value of the study, RKNA tested research instruments with the Walters, and we announced the 6 museum partners. And that summer, RKNA and NAEA submitted research applications to all the involved school districts. That was a huge project. So year 2, let's get to business. Planning and piloting is finished. 2016 to 2017 is the year that we collected data. In the autumn, RKNA finalized research approvals with the school districts and invited schools to participate in the study. That winter, RKNA delivered and collected parent and guardian permission forms for student participation in the study and collected pre-program questionnaires. And I'll go through the instruments in a little bit. And in the spring, RKNA conducted museum and classroom observations and collected post-program data, including student interviews, teacher questionnaires, and museum educator interviews. And now we're in year 3, or finishing up year 3. From the summer of 2017 to the summer of 2018, RKNA processed the data and prepared reports. Critical readers, including our advisory group, provided feedback on different versions of the report documents. And I'm happy to say, come autumn 2018, that the impact of art museum programs on students' research study results and a user guide will be published. It may kill us all, but it will be published. And NAEA is going to host a culminating symposium at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And I will share information on that at the end of this presentation. So we've talked about the why and the who and the when, and now talking about the where. Our site selection, it was really well thought out. NAEA, AAMD, and RKNA selected 6 museums across the country based on data from the field-wide survey that was administered to art museums in 2015. And in the criteria included that the museums serve an ample number of students in grades 4th, 5th, and 6th, that they serve Title I schools, they have a student-to-teacher ratio of 16 to 20 or fewer students per facilitator, that they include 4 to 5 or fewer stops at works of art during the program, that the museum train facilitators in more than one area, such as art history and inquiry. They articulate and apply outcomes to train facilitators, and they conduct evaluation/assessment and implement the results. So those were the criteria that we used when selecting the museums. The selected sites, using the criteria, we identified 20 potential sites, 3 to 4 per AAMD region. And our goal was to include sites that vary in size, type of collection, and governance. And we also considered logistics, such as the number of students served and school district research requirements. That was really important. We needed to make sure that we had school districts who were open to us doing this research in their schools. And there was a lot of moving parts with that. So our participating sites were the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Ohio, the Orlando Museum of Art in Orlando, Florida, the RISD Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, and the Walters Museum of Art in Baltimore, Maryland. Walters continued on after being our pilot museum, and we were very excited that they did that. So you can see that they're very geographically diverse and represent a lot of different types of museums. So here's where we get into the how. And as I mentioned, the critical to this research study is the framework developed for describing and theorizing the potential benefits to students of facilitated single-visit art museum programs. In line with recent research and based on input from art museum educators about the purpose of their work, we chose to focus this research on 5 capacities: creative thinking, critical thinking, human connections, sensorial and affective response, and academic connections. And you'll see that academic connections lies underneath the other 4, because we feel that the other 4 really do contribute to academic connections. And we also saw that these do not happen individually, that they all do work together. And we saw that coming out of our research. So first, critical thinking. In the last decade, we've witnessed an emphasis on critical thinking as a key outcome of single-visit art museum programs, partly as a result of the emphasis placed on critical thinking in schools. Critical thinking can be conceptualized in different ways, and we subscribe to the definition whereby critical thinking involves deducing and inferring conclusions from available facts and calls for demanding that claims be backed by evidence, as well as seeing both sides of an issue and being open to new evidence that disconfirms your ideas. And this definition really aligns with the two measures of critical thinking, evidential reasoning and multiple interpretations, that we use. So evidential reasoning is students' ability to provide relevant visual evidence from a work of art to explain their interpretation of what is going on in that work of art. And multiple interpretations is students' belief that there is more than one way to understand or interpret a work of art. And some teacher behaviors, we have a lot of wonderful tools that we'll be sharing. And some teacher behaviors we observed were that facilitators help students to observe, look closely, that they help students to describe what they see, that they help students connect observations to previous knowledge, and that they help students to interpret visual images, speculate, and draw conclusions. Our next capacity was creative thinking. And like critical thinking, these two often go together. And how we defined creative thinking was questioning. Questioning is students' proclivity to ask questions about a work of art in relationship to their interpretation of it. The questions are complex, asking why or how, and or how. That students are imagining possibilities is students' ability to provide a second interpretation of a work of art that is divergent from their first. And comfort with ambiguity is the student's awareness that art is not immediately understandable. And you can see the close alignment with critical thinking, and the two are frequently referred to together as they represent two capacities central to cognition. Nevertheless, critical thinking emphasizes logic and analysis, and while creative thinking stresses imagination and the unknown. And when measuring creative thinking we noted when facilitators helped students to question and wonder, facilitators helped students envision alternative possibilities, different ways of seeing and responding, and facilitators help students gain comfort with ambiguity, complexity, and the unknown. Our next capacity is sensorial and affective response. And this is probably the most elusive of the five capacities, and it evokes the ability of the senses, referring to the student's experience a heightened perceptual, kinesthetic, or emotional response to artworks in museum spaces. While most art museum educators would argue that single-visit art museum programs activate students sensorially and emotionally, little evidence exists to demonstrate what does that look like. And we will say that we were limited in our ability to measure this capacity because of its subtle qualities that could benefit from exclusive focus. Thus, for the purposes of this study, our measures investigated students' emotional as opposed to sensorial responses to the museum experience. Nevertheless, we view the two, emotion and senses, as linked, as asserted by neuroscientist Jamie Ward, who explained that experiences that involve multiple senses, as museum experiences do, activate different neural systems, resulting in richer memories. And this connection is implicit in our measures as defined here. Emotive recall is students' demonstration of strong emotions in the recollection of single visit program, as indicated by the vividness of description, robustness of detail, and the use of words or phrases that convey emotion of any kind, not just positive. And captivation is students' perception of that art is amazing or awe-inspiring. And some teacher behaviors you may see is that facilitators help students experience a heightened perceptual, kinesthetic, or emotional response to objects in museum spaces, that they help students experience captivation, absorption, and sustained attention, and that they help students experience a sense of wonder or awe, redirection from self towards everything else. Second to last is human connections. And as human connections, as well as empathy, is a domain of great interest to museum educators, not just those in art museums. It has been argued that museums, through their collections of artifacts and objects, are an ideal setting for stimulating visitors' sense of connection to others and self. However, human connections is quite broad, describing connections with humanity, relevant themes presented in artworks, other cultures or eras, and the artist. Empathy is a heightened is heightened in some accounts of human connections, whether the focus is on feeling empathy triggered by the physicality of an object, or empathy based on the knowledge about another situation, or perhaps both. For the purposes of this study, we operationalized human connections in terms of connection with lived experience is the student's ability to connect with human experience through art across culture and time and place. Connection to the artist is students feeling personally connected to artworks or their makers, and connection to self or community is students deepening of their sense excuse me, of self in one's community. And the teaching behaviors that we measured for human connections is that we saw the facilitators help students connect with human experiences across culture, time, and place, that they help students to make personal connection to artworks, objects or their makers, and that facilitators help students deepen or broaden their sense of self in their community, school, city. And finally, the last capacity was academic connections. And as I mentioned, academic connections really lies underneath all the other ones because they really are interconnected. And we defined academic connections as the students' perceived relevance of what they learn in the museum to what they learn and aspire for in school. And the teaching behavior that we saw with that is that facilitators help students to apply classroom knowledge, vocabulary concepts, etc., in a new context. So those were the capacities that we measured. And I'm going to let Michelle take over a second so I can get a drink of water and go through the next couple slides on the methodology.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So you still get to push forward with the slides. But so for this study, when we worked with Randy Korn and Associates, the goal for the research was to conduct a methodologically rigorous study that could measure the effects of the facilitated single visit art museum programs with students. And as shown in this diagram, RK&A conducted a quasi-experimental study that included 3 study groups. So we have treatment A, the little museum icon at the top, where participants received a single visit art museum program facilitated either by an art museum educator or a docent, in which students view original works of art. In treatment B, students participated in a single visit school or classroom-based program facilitated by an art museum educator or docent, in which students view reproductions of works of art. And that was done deliberately to help us really hone in on the research question of what benefit do art museums provide for that learning environment. So this is a way to look for differences between the environments. And then lastly, control were students that did not receive either a program in the museum or the classroom. And as I said before, with treatment group B, really trying to look again at which learning environment kind of sticks, or are there differences between viewing works of art in person in a museum context and then reproductions in the classroom. So, excuse me. And then for the next slide.
There we go.
That's okay. So there's a lot of data, as Emily has mentioned. So we have a couple different things. So data collectors observed museum and classroom programs. So basically what that means is during the programs, trained observers took notes, writing down exactly what facilitators said and did during the program. The observer then completed a standardized observation guide within 24 hours of the program, providing ratings for the extent to which the facilitators supported students in the 5 capacities. So that was one of our main ways of understanding facilitator moves. Then we had pre and post program questionnaires where we were asking students to try to get a sense of the change in the perceptions as a result of the museum or classroom program. We conducted interviews with students in all 3 study groups after the program intervention. That includes collecting interviews or a talk aloud interview where students were asked to think or talk out loud about this work of art, where we have a reproduction here on this slide. Asked them to talk out loud about it. And again, the timing was done in a way where, regardless of what group the students were in, they all were asked at the same time of the year. So just pointing that out, that was collected in the spring. Teachers themselves completed post-program questionnaires where we were asking information about teaching practices and students' exposure to cultural institutions. Again, are there certain trends depending on certain regions or certain types of museums? We were kind of thinking about different ways we could splice the data with that. And then to dive deeper into what teachers value about facilitated single visit art museum programs, our KNA conducted interviews with the teachers. Teachers are booking visits to museums on perhaps annually. What is it about visiting the art museum that teachers are really excited about, or what drives them to book those types of programs for their students, and what might it take in order for those visits to happen? So that's kind of interesting to hear it directly from them. And then lastly, museum educators or volunteer docents were participated in interviews. So the primary purpose was to explore what those museum educators or volunteer docents value about single visit art museum programs for students, and also to give them an opportunity to discuss the challenges that they may encounter when facilitating those types of programs. And do you want me to do one more slide? Do you want me to do the next one?
If you want to do the next couple and
Okay.
talk about the program context,
sure.
And then I'll pick up with the key takeaways.
Okay, so just to give a sense of the volume or just the breadth of this study, so as we said, Randy Korn and Associates with our research partner did a lot of work. So they observed over 100 museum and classroom programs, and again, we had 6 different sites, over 4,000 pre and post program questionnaires. They conducted 627 interviews with students in all 3 study groups after the program interventions took place. Almost 100 teachers completed the post-program questionnaires. They interviewed 13 participating teachers, and then interviewed 19 museum educators and volunteer docents who participated as well. And let's see. So just to give a sense of the types of programs, so I think Emily was saying this before, is that most art museums offer some type of one-time museum visit experience for K through 12 students. There might be certain age levels that we might focus on, but part of the both the survey for our membership, but again at these 6 sites, what were some of the averages that we started to notice, or how do we define what a single visit is? So in this case, for participating programs, the average museum time is over an hour, closer to an hour and 15 minutes. And then in the classroom, it's clocking in a little bit under an hour. At the museum, students are seeing on average 7 works of art, while in the classroom-based program, those students saw 5 reproductions. We had a much higher rate of facilitation by docents in the museum. So again, volunteers that have been trained by the educators, that's 77%, whereas in the classroom, those programs were more like a 50-50 split between museum educators or a docent that's leading those programs. And then the ratio is fairly similar, where it's 10-to-1 students in the museum and 11-to-1 in the classroom. So again, just trying to get a better grip of like what types of programs we're actually looking at. Do you want me to pass the baton back to you?
I can pick it up from here if you'd like.
Okay.
So this next, how is the program context? And as was expected, observations revealed that programs in both the museum and the classroom varied from museum to museum and also from facilitator to facilitator. However, all prescribed the inquiry-based model that we desired to study. That was really important. In our observations of the program, we focused on understanding the teacher practices employed by the facilitator leading the single visit art museum program, particularly as related to the 5 capacity areas. And to be clear, we did not use the observations to measure student response to the programs. During the observations, data collectors, as we said, as Michelle said, took open-ended notes related to teaching behaviors to support the 5 capacities being explored, as well as whether facilitators supported students in observing/looking closely and describing what students saw. Overall, we found that teaching behaviors that support critical thinking were given strongest emphasis. In particular, facilitators' support of students to interpret visual images, speculate, and draw conclusions is robust. And you'll see on our chart that is rated second highest as shown in our graph here, and it's color-coded. Hopefully you can all see that. By comparison, teaching behaviors that supported academic connections were the weakest. However, substantial limitation is that for academic connections to be noted, we relied on the facilitator to explicitly acknowledge connections between the program and what students are learning in schools. Arguably, much of what students do during the program connects to learning in school, but we relied on facilitators' verbal articulation of these connections to the students during the program. So we needed to hear them say, hey, you're learning about X at school, and this relates to that. So the strongest were in critical thinking, right up, and we saw that as what the facilitator was doing. We also saw that things that were most likely to happen at the museum is in the sensorial and affective response, that facilitators help the students experience a heightened perceptual, kinesthetic, or emotional response to objects. And that we also saw that students experience captivation, absorption, and sustained attention. And I think that those of us that are museum educators know what that looks like. It's almost physical. You see kids sit up a little taller and really get engrossed in what they're looking at. And it was really wonderful to see that that was coming out in our research. So here we are. You've sat with us for the last 40 minutes, and finally the key takeaways of this study has been a lot of work, and we're really excited with the benefits that we have discovered. And those are in 4 areas that relate to the capacities in multiple ways. And using this chart, you'll see that first, and I'll go through each one of these, questioning, that students ask more complex questions about a work of art. And this ties into creative thinking and critical thinking. That there are multiple interpretations, and students are more accepting of multiple interpretations of a work of art. And you see that this is tapping into creative thinking, critical thinking, and human connections. The physicality of art. Students are more likely to think of art in terms of their material properties, and this is touching on creative thinking, sensorial and affective response, and human connections. And finally, emotive recall, that students experience greater emotive recall of the program, and this is tapping into human connections and sensorial and affective response. So the first being questioning. Students who received a museum program ask more complex questions. Students were asked, what do you wonder about as you look at this painting? The measure emphasizes the complexity of the queries and not just the quantity of queries. For instance, a student who scores high in questioning and wondering will ask questions that explore why something is the way it is. The questions also connect to an interpretation or hypothesis that the student has about a work of art or artists. By comparison, students who score low on this measure may not ask any questions, or the questions are limited to the who, what, where, when, and why type of questions. And you'll see that we did see that what was happening in the museum program, really, this happened more within the museum program than it did in the classroom or the treatment group B program. Second is multiple interpretations. Students who receive museum program are more likely to accept multiple interpretations. And students who had the museum program, which were, like I said, were treatment group A, were more likely to disagree with the statement, quote, all people should understand a work of art in the same way, end quote, than students who did not have a museum program, which is our control. This is a positive finding because it shows that students who had a museum program recognize that art can be interpreted in different ways by different people. While the statement is one we categorized as critical thinking, the flexibility of thinking it suggests overlaps with creative thinking. Next is the physicality of art, and that students who received a museum program are more likely to describe art materials. These responses were generated from an open-ended question that asked, quote, what comes to mind when you think about art? This finding echoes those from a small study of teens by Olga Hubbard, showing that direct engagement with objects also seemed to trigger students' sense of touch. In turn, this seemed to prompt speculation among students about the artist's choices and creative processes, reflections which were not at all evident among those who viewed reproductions. So is that being in the presence of an actual work of art and not a reproduction really did tap into, helped with this finding, which was kind of exciting. And finally, emotive recall. Students who received a museum program are more likely to describe their program experience vividly and emotively. And the first question we asked of students was, what part of the visit stands out as the most memorable? Was open-ended to allow students to name any standout aspects of the program. Examples could be the elevator, the bus ride, hopefully the works of art. And a second question focused on the works of art. And it was, I'd like you to think back and recall one work of art. Can you describe that work of art? The scores did not privilege general experiences versus experiences with works of art. Note that to gauge emotion, the score relied more heavily on listening to the audio recording of the interview than written transcripts for scoring. Rapidness of response, tone of voice, and vividness of the description all informed scoring. Notably, students who received a museum program, treatment A, scored higher on this measure than students who received a classroom program, treatment B, meaning their response was more emotional. And this is a really great chart that RKNA created that looks at the cause and the effect. So the cause, what happens during a typical single visit program in an art museum? Observations indicate the average conditions of 73-minute program, mostly are led by volunteer docents. The student to teacher ratio is 10 to 1 or less. It includes 7 stops at original works of art, and artwork is mostly representational versus abstract, largely 2D and some 3D and media. Observations show that pedagogy frequently supports students in interpreting, connecting observations to previous knowledge, recognizing multiple interpretations, questioning and investigating, experiencing awe and captivation, and connecting with human experience. And then on the effect is the chart that I showed before that shows where the 4 key findings relate to the capacities. And, you know, this has been a huge study and we're really excited about the results. So in conclusion, we found that facilitated single visit art museum programs using inquiry-based pedagogies provide a unique opportunity to engage with original works of art in a different learning environment. This study shows that engaging with original works of art in an art museum has a stronger impact on students than looking at reproductions. It inspires students to question and investigate. As students look closely, share ideas, and discover personal connections, facilitated single visit art museum programs inspire and foster their creativity and curiosity. Practicing these skills across a variety of learning environments has the potential to contribute to meaningful cognitive gains. The results of this study help validate that the work of museums is important and impactful to student learning and skill development. And since we have mostly museum educators here, museum educators should feel empowered to champion facilitated single visit art museum programs using the specific benefits measured in this study. We're really excited at what we've learned, and could have learned the absolute opposite, but we're very excited that we learned what we did. And you know, what's next is reporting and dissemination. The sharing of report documents, we're almost there. Look for the official launch of our summary and discussion and the technical report in appendix mid-September. I'm going to say mid-September because as soon as I say a date, we'll miss it. And after, then we are also having a symposium at the Detroit Institute of Arts on Saturday, October 13. And there's the bit.ly link for that. We would love for you to join us. It's going to be a great day of unpacking the results, talking through the user guide, and some experiences in the galleries of really applying what we learned and some of those teacher, how we facilitate different programs and how to apply that in the galleries. And then after the symposium will be the publication of the user guide before the end of the year. We are working on the draft of that now. We are going to use, and we'll be sharing that with people who, a draft of that who go to the symposium, and we'll be refining it after the symposium based on feedback we receive at the symposium. And that user guide really is just that. It will help. So often you have a research and you need help of, okay, I've read this research. how do I use it? How do I apply it to the work that I do? And our hope is that the user guide will help with that. So now we are at the point, if there are questions, we would love to field those. If you have really in-depth questions about the research design and the results, you can talk to Stephanie Downey or Amanda Krantz at RKNA. If you have questions about dissemination or anything else, you can always talk to me. And that's my email there, or Megan Panisi, who is our project manager, who has been working very diligently pulling everything together in the last year to get this going. So I would encourage questions, and hopefully your questions will help us think about things that we may not have thought about before, because we're almost to the point that we're too close to it at this point. Does anybody have any questions?
So if you have questions, because some folks joined us after we got started, there's a toolbar at the bottom if you scroll over your own screen, and there's a chat box at the bottom, and if you click on that, you can type in questions. It'll say it automatically defaults to Zoom group chat, so we're monitoring that right now. Actually, as we were going over this again, Emily, I was just struck when you were talking through the academic connections capacity and the results that that showed that the majority of what was happening in single museum visits right now tends to focus, the facilitation moves tend to focus on promoting or encouraging critical thinking skills, and then the facilitator making those explicit connections to what is happening in the classroom is one of the least that came up during those program observations. And I was just thinking, this is 2018, and if we had done this study 15 years ago, I think we would have probably seen a flip or a reversal of that, where it's just really interesting to think about what is the role of those academic connections or content, what is the role of the skill development that we're encouraging during these programs. And it also, for me, made me think a lot about two things. One is, how are we describing what happens in the museum visit to teachers or to stakeholders, to parents, administrators, policymakers? How do we know when that's happening? And could we possibly be overpromising what happens in a single museum visit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And we've chatted about that, and I will say the art museum, the Cincinnati Art Museum, is definitely, when we put our school and teacher brochure out, these are our math tours, these are our science tours, these are our social studies tours, because we have heard from teachers that they need to show how it applies to the rest of the curriculum to be able to come for a visit. And it has been really interesting to look at, should we be promising that? Should we be looking at it through that lens? Because we are also heard from teachers that they just want to have the experience of coming to the museum.
Right, yeah. Right, and that, like, being in that different environment, or just kind of getting out of the classroom, but in a, not just, there's many places you could take students, so thinking about what is it about the art museum that's unique. And the part two that was making me think through a little bit was, how do we go about training our docents or museum teachers or volunteers, or even educators, I should say, how are we teaching those that teach in the art museum? And what are we diving deeper into in terms of practice? What are we diving deeper into which artworks you select? And I know sometimes that depends on routes that people need to take, or routes around the museum. And how are we preparing them for different types of groups that could come in the museum? And are the trainings that we provide for those staff and volunteers aligned with what we say on our websites or in our brochures of what's going to happen when you bring a class to our museum?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot, and have been sharing the facilitator guides with folks here at the Art Museum, and really looking at how we observe our docents and aligning it a bit more to what we found in the study. Because I think that is going to be a very valuable tool to museum educators moving forward, is just our observation guide. And we are going to let people use that because it will really help us create trainings on how do you facilitate critical thinking? How do you facilitate creative thinking, in the hopes that we can see these things happening. So we are definitely going to be using it in our docent observations moving forward in the next couple of years, and kind of looking at our training. I know I'm probably already on the slate here to do this presentation I just did for our docents, and I hope that other museum educators will share that as well.
Yeah, I think it's, and like you said at the beginning too, one of the most useful, we're just having a conversation, you and I, in case
Yeah,
anybody else has questions, feel free in the
please.
chat. But I think that the other thing that really struck me, having, like you, being involved really early in the process of this project, which is hard to believe it's been 6-7 years that this has been going on. But when Jackie Terrassa, the NAEA Museum Education Division Director prior to you, was writing the IMLS grant funding this project, and she spent a lot of time gathering resources that would become the beginning of our literature review for the study. And two of the things that she said at the time were it was really striking to her that the majority of the research out there on field trips or one-time visits really were coming more from science or natural history settings, museums, and those types of organizations, not art museums. And a lot of the research that was coming out of art museums, or at least around K through 12 education, at that time was really looking at multiple visit programs, because I think a lot of us had a lot of confidence in those types of programs, or just that you're spending more time together, we're working on reaching certain types of outcomes, and we had more resources for those types of programs and studying them. So, but I also remember clearly she was just starting to look at a couple, like just a handful of museums, and how they described on their websites what happens on one-time tours or visits. And she was like, it's all over the place. And I was like, yeah, it's kind of like a buffet where we kind of say, like, here's all the different things that can happen when you come, pick which one applies most to you. And again, going back to that question again of like, what are we trying to accomplish in these programs, and do we want to provide many different ways and teachers can pick? Are there specific, I know some museums kind of hone in on one or two type of goals, or looking for specific outcomes in those visits, and work hard to communicate that. So I know it's just a lot to ponder as we kind of think through the results a little bit more.
It is lots to ponder. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that we were very specific with the museums, the participating museums and the classroom programs, that they did not have a studio component, that they were only gallery-based programs, because we know that some museums offer a tour and art making experience, and we wanted to make sure it was almost the same across the board. They could use touring tools in their gallery programs, use writing and sketching if they wanted to, but that we asked them not to have a specific studio component to the museum program, because we wanted to make sure it was the same across the board, and the same with classroom programs. And we also asked that there not be any pre-visit experiences, so no one going out to the school before a tour happened. They could send out pre-visit materials like lesson plans and things like that many of us do, but we asked them not to go out to a school beforehand, because I think that we wanted to make sure that everything was as fair and even across, not even, but the same across the board. And the same with the classroom programs. The classroom programs did not have an art making component, and a lot of museums that do classroom programs have an art making component, and we wanted to replicate the museum experience as close as possible through the use of reproduction, so it could be measurable.
Sure.
And I neglected to say that.
No, that's okay. That's a great point. And then I also was reminded early on, as we were starting to map out the conditions for teaching, and there was a huge debate that we had about, should this only be studying museum educators that lead these experiences, or only docents? And I remember Randy Korn was insistent that we need to have both, because otherwise it invites speculation of like, this is why the results came out this way, or this is what it would have looked like in the other way, because from my recollection, we didn't see any major differences in the way that the programs were facilitated. So because I know that was a huge question that came up at NAEA 2018 when we were just in Seattle sharing the preliminary results. So yeah, I think it's just, like I said, a lot to to think about and to continue thinking about.
Yes.
And I'm really, if you don't mind going back just one more slide, that I think the one of the culminating events for this, or the two ways we're culminating this project, is this symposium and in-person get-together to talk through the results, to talk through expectations and how we approach this type of programming, which the majority of us do offer within our museums, and thinking through that a little bit. And we're thrilled because we know we are going to have some museum directors that'll join us as well. So, and I think we also have some educators from the local Detroit area joining us. So it really will be an interesting mix of participants, and it's, it'll be an exciting day. So I hope you join us in Detroit. And then, as Emily said, after that symposium in mid-October, we're going to then use some feedback from that day to finalize that user guide, which will be published primarily through the web, and I'm not sure. Yeah, so I think that we want these to be tools that can be used by lots of different stakeholders. And there was something related to that I was going to transition into, but I can't remember. But
I will just say is we are creating a website specifically, or we have created a website specifically for this study, where all these materials will be. And if you are a paper person and want to print it all, you can, and we're formatting it in a way that you can print it all, but we wanted to save some trees. So it is web-based, it is dynamic, they're PDFs that you can, and it's being designed so that you can print it off and you can give it to your museum docents or your museum director and say, this is what this is all about. So you can use those tools. And as Michelle said about the symposium, we are having a panel discussion with three museum directors to really talk about, so what does this all mean for the bigger museum landscape? And it will be really interesting to hear from them about the study and speak to how this may change the type of work we do and the way that we do our work, because many museums really do rely upon single visit art museum programs for students, and rely on those attendance numbers. And how is this study and how is this going to change how we think about those programs? So I'm really fascinated to hear what they have to say about that, because it will offer insight that we don't always get to hear. And being partners with AAMD has made that happen, and they have been amazing partners through this entire thing. And it has given us museum educators who are very much in our museum education world the opportunity to think about what is the bigger impact of this outside of museum education.
And I think related to that, I just wanted to highlight on the microsite, or the website that we have for this study, and I inserted that into the group chat here, and we can hyperlink it at the end. We try to be as transparent as possible. So we have our literature review, we have our white paper, we will have our user guide, and we will have a technical report. So if you're one of those people that really likes to dive into the data, that's something that RKNA is very open to sharing. And there's, as you can probably imagine, there are many questions that come out of this study. And one thing that I've already started to hear is, how does in-person museum visits relate to virtual field trips or virtual visits? And that was not in the scope of this project, but that's an awesome way to build on this type of work. So I think that we definitely wanted to create kind of like a core amount of research and resources that could be used and referred to, but also built upon in the future. So please contact us if you're somebody who wants to dive a little bit deeper. And as I said, hopefully some of you will join us in Detroit, and we will look forward to sharing more of our resources as we continue to wrap up the dissemination portion of the study. So thank you, Emily. That was a lot of talking on your behalf.
Okay.
And I also want to say thank you for your leadership with this project as the project director, because it's a big project, and NAEA and other colleagues in the field are very appreciative of everything that you've done. So thank you.
Ready to give birth.
Yes. So thank you all again for
Thank
joining
you.
us, and we will meet up again the last Wednesday of September for, which I think is September 26th, to talk about one of our other initiatives called Viewfinder, which is our digital publication. If you Google NAEA Museum Education Viewfinder, you will find our medium.com digital publication there, and our editors will talk about what that project is, how to go about writing for us, and what the next steps will be in the next year's worth of issues. So thank you again, and follow along with us on our social media and hashtag Art Impact as we move forward. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.